Theological Institute here at Holy Family Catholic Church in Austin, Texas. We're in the middle of a study on Mariology. Amanda was just noting that we had recently a three-part study on Mariology, Josephology, and Christology here at the Holy Family. This time we're focusing during this month of June. We began in May our study of Mariology during the month of Mary, and we'll finish it before we go on break here at the end of June. We remember that Mariology, anytime we see ology at the end of the word, it means the study of something. That comes from a Greek word logos, which means the word. So Jesus was the word made flesh. Jesus was the logos, the word. So anytime we talk about a study of something, it's the word on something. So that, for instance, the study of zoology is the study, O-L-O-G-Y, tells us the study of something. It's the study of animals. Oh, zoos in Greek is animal. In this case, what is Mariology the study of? Is the study of Mario, study of Maria, of Mary. The study of Mary we refer to as Mariology. One of the fascinating things that we were breaking open in our last conversation that went really, really deep, really quickly, in fact, we didn't even get through a page of our notes, was the distinction between the Miryam of history and the Mary of faith, which is similar to the distinction that we make in Christology between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. How it was that there was a historical person, Jesus, Yeshua in his language. Yeshua was a person who really lived some 2,000 years ago. But then stories were told of him. Different things came to be believed about him. Different layers were put on him, creating the Christ of faith. You could say the same with Mary, how it is that the Miryam, her name in her language, the Miryam of history, we had various layers of stories that were told about her, various beliefs that arose about her, and that becomes the Mary of our faith. We left off on the bottom of page 1, Miryam of Nazareth. One of the questions that scholars ask is how much we can actually know about this Miryam of history, this Miryam of Nazareth, this woman who gave birth to Jesus. Partly because, let's just face it, she was a woman, which in her era means what? Women were a very marginalized subset of the population. We didn't tell stories on women in the same way that we told stories of men, painting them as heroes. And so what we'll notice is that the life of Jesus died roughly around 30 AD. The first stories of Jesus were written around 60 to 65 AD, Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Luke, which is going to paint Mary most favorably, is written somewhere around 85 AD. So it took roughly 55 years for us to come to an evolved picture of Mary. Mark, as we're about to see, is going to have a much lower picture of Mary. Luke is the one who's going to have a much higher picture of Mary. In fact, St. Luke today is the patron saint of painters. And often, if you see a statue of a person who is painting, look closely at the painting. If that painting is a painting of Mary, then that's probably an image of St. Luke. And if St. Luke is the patron saint of painters and is painting a picture of Mary, what does that tell us about his esteem for Mary? He's going to have a much higher picture of Mary than Mark will. In fact, his gospel is going to center around Mary. Chapters 1 and 2 of his gospel is going to be the story of how it was that the angel came not to Joseph, but came to Mary. Yeshua, Mary's son, whom we know as Jesus in English, caused little reaction in Jewish and pagan literature. Very little was written about Jesus. And so even less we can expect to be written about his mother. History treated her like so many other women as largely invisible in that time and place. And so now we begin to piece together her life, the details of her life and her son's life. And so as we piece together their lives, we start to see what it is that we can learn about Jesus and what it is we can learn about his mother, Mary. And we acknowledge when we use those words, Jesus and Mary, we're using English words. In their language, he would have been known as Yeshua. She would have been known as Miryam. And her husband, Yosef. One of the things that makes it difficult is that from early on, from about the time that after St. Luke was writing, there are others who started telling stories like St. James, according to the tradition. We have a gospel that's attributed to St. James, was written in James' spirit and in James' name. James, for instance, tells the story of how it was that the angel Gabriel came and visited Mary. And how did Mary become pregnant? Because one of the feathers dropped from Gabriel's wing. Follow me now. One of the feathers dropped from the wing and touched Mary's stomach, and boom, she was pregnant. I don't know. I won't pretend to know more about the human body than I do know, but I'm imagining that if a feather falls in your stomach, that's not how women tend to become pregnant. But that was a story that was told from early on. And it was that same proto-gospel of St. James that gave us the names of Mary's parents, for instance. What are the names of Mary's parents according to the tradition of the church? Saint Joachim and Anna. Okay. Where do we get those names from the Bible? That story didn't make the cut. That comes to us from the proto-gospel of St. James. So from early on, we have various stories and legends that started developing around Mary, which makes it even more difficult to separate the Mary of our faith from the historical Miryam. What can we say then about this Miryam? And we could spell this different ways. I spell it with a Y here. I see on the handout it's spelled with an I. It's just a matter of how we transliterate that name. What can we say about Miryam? Apparently, she lived in Nazareth. Where was Nazareth? We know that Jerusalem was in the south. Nazareth was up in the north. It was near a town, Sepphoris, which is important because if Joseph was indeed a craftsman, or sometimes we translate it as carpenter, if Joseph was, and if he taught his son Jesus this trade as well, Sepphoris was a big city that was being built at that time. So you can imagine Jesus and Joseph both using their skills in the building of this city. And if that was the case, what does that tell us about Jesus and Joseph? That while Mary likely helped to take care of the details of the home and collaborated with the other women around her, while their men and sons were off working, Joseph and Jesus were off working in Sepphoris, which at that time, what was the language of the Roman Empire in that area? Was not Latin, it was Greek. And so in order for them to exercise their occupations, they probably would have been interacting a bit in Greek. Miryam was apparently Jewish. The stories that come to us from the Gospels suggest that she was a young Jewish lady. She lived in an area under Roman dominion. So at the time, Nazareth, Jerusalem, the entire Holy Land, as we call it today, was part of the Roman Empire. So it was occupied by Roman soldiers and enjoyed relative peace during her life. There were no major upsets at that time, no major conflicts between the Jewish people and the Romans. She was likely 12 or 13 years old when she conceived, likely some 14 years or so when she gave birth to her son. Where would stories like this, or why would we speculate this? I say there's no reason to believe that, like today, for instance, typically girls get through high school and maybe off to some college or so. So they're usually not becoming mothers until late teens, early to mid 20s, early to mid 30s. Was that true in Mary's day as well? Did they have high schools at that time? No. Which creates this interesting dynamic because she, being a woman, if there were schools at that time, they would have been attended by boys at that time. So it's conceivable that Jesus might have received some limited schooling. Paul certainly did. Mary at that time probably had no access to education. Many pictures of St. Anne show St. Anne teaching Mary the alphabet. So if you see a statue of one woman teaching a girl holding up a tablet with the Hebrew alphabet on it, who would those two women be, the woman and the girl? If you see a woman and a girl and a tablet with the Jewish alphabet, that would be Anna teaching her daughter Mary the alphabet. An anachronism, meaning Anna probably didn't have a tablet with the Hebrew letters on it that she taught her daughter the alphabet, but it is how it is that we've captured those two women in iconography. Iconography is the study of the church's art, so that any time that we look at a religious image, we can figure out who that person is by how it is that they're dressed, or who they're with, or what they're holding, etc.
Father Jamie, can I tell my friends that that Mary was going to be stoned to death if she didn't have a husband? Is that correct, or is it
almost? She would have been open to be stoned to death if she was pregnant.
She was pregnant
outside of her marriage. So she was betrothed to Joseph. She was wedded to Joseph. So if she was found pregnant with another man's child, she could have been stoned to death.
But Joseph married her.
According to the story that we have in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew tells the story of Joseph taking her as her own and providing that cover for her and her child. Of Joseph believing, this is a story of faith, of Joseph believing that no, this was not some guy who violated my wife, instead who believed that this was by God.
The Old Testament was very cruel to women, right? I mean, were they stoned to death just because they
it was part of the Mosaic law. It was part of the Mosaic law that that exposed them to death. But we wouldn't want to make the generalization about women in general in the Old Testament, because there are some heroic women in the New Testament as well. Part of our podcast, Extraordinary Catholics podcast, lifts up women in scriptures who are tremendous models for us. People like the woman that Mary was named for. Who is Mary named for? Mary's name in Hebrew was Miryam. Do we see other instances of Miryams in the scripture? Who's the most famous Miryam in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures? That was Moses's sister. She was such a tremendous person, Moses' sister Miryam, that many Jewish families named their daughters Miryam. Did any of us watch last week the conclusion of the marvelous Mrs. Maisel show on Netflix? Mrs. Maisel, what was her first name? Miryam. Who was she named after? She was Jewish, named after Moses' sister. Popular Jewish name for women. In the same way that Mary was a popular name for English-speaking girls, for European-born girls for years and years and years. So Mary, as a result, once a girl experienced puberty and her first period, that girl typically was marryable. I'm trying to find the most polite words to frame this, but a girl at that age was able to be married. And so we like to think of age 18 as being the age of consent. That's a very recent invention in human history. In the ancient world, we didn't wait until a girl could consent at age 18. When she was through puberty, she was able to bear children. And in an age when the lifespan was much shorter, we didn't live to be 70, 80, 90 years old, it was important that our girls be helping us to populate our nation. That sounds so crude. But we do remember a basic lesson of community organizing. Where does power and influence come from? Organizing people and or resources. We need the people. I mean, that's why the Latino population now, the majority of students in our public schools in Texas are Latino students, are Hispanic students, right? So Mary was likely some 12 to 13 years old when she conceived, likely had given birth to Jesus by age 14-ish, which is why when we celebrate quinceañeras in the Hispanic culture, in the Latino culture, it's something for us to remember that these young ladies who are turning 15 years old, we look to other models like Mary as someone who, though she was young, was taking on adult responsibilities. Mary likely worked hard back in that era, right? Women around her probably taught her various skills, like how to make clothes for herself and her family, how to fetch water, how to do various things, cooking, etc., around the house. Right? Mary certainly didn't read or wear satin robes. This is an interesting statement that comes to us because when we think of Mary, the way that we have painted her traditionally has been, as often European painters who never saw any photos of Mary. They never saw any pictures of Mary. Why didn't they see any pictures of Mary? Because there were no pictures, there were no photos. And so they're just imagining what Mary looked like. And if you were a European, right, a white, Northern European, imagining what Mary looked like, you probably looked at your daughter or your granddaughter and thought, oh, I bet Mary looked like that. And that's what you painted. And so they tended to paint Mary in their own image and wearing clothes that resembled the clothes that they had in their own day. So if you were living in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, you were likely painting images of Mary that looked more like you and your family than the actual Miryam of Nazareth. Because at that time, would they have known what Miryam of Nazareth or persons from that part of the world at that time looked like? Mary certainly didn't read or wear satin robes. That seems a bit of a controversial statement, especially when we see these images of Mary being taught to read by her mother, except that remember, back at that time, women were not included within circles of education. Remember, no one recorded Yeshua's or Miriam's words or lives while they were alive. There was no one writing about them at this time. That's one of the things that's interesting, because the stories that we have of Jesus, they're told as if they were written at that time, right? Then Jesus said to his disciples, then he told them this parable, then he did this, then he did that. It's written as if it were told, as if those people were following him around with a pen and a paper and writing down everything that he said. These things weren't written until much later. And so what we have before then is simply the oral tradition, the stories that were told of them. As we're fond of saying, the Bible isn't a book of history, it's a book of faith, a book of theology, showing the significance of these people in hindsight. So what we have is, we have Mark reflecting on Jesus and Mary and telling stories about them for their significance in the story of salvation. Or Luke reflecting on Jesus and Mary and telling stories of why they're significant in the history of salvation. Or later, John or others, St. James, according to the tradition, others who are telling stories about them and their role in our salvation. Let's just pause right there and see if there are any questions, comments, any thoughts that are stirred by anything that we've said so far, anything that we're stepping into. The other thing that we note about the Gospels is that the Gospels aren't about Mary. The Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, who are those stories about? They're stories about Jesus. So the stories focus on the guy, and his mother is somewhat secondary, if you will. Really, the stories focus on Jesus, our Christ, our Savior, the Anointed One, the Messiah. But in order to understand who Jesus was, we naturally had to tell stories of his mother as well. Partly because people were asking questions. After Mark had written his story and said so little about Mary, people started asking, well, where did Jesus come from? Tell us more about his family. And that's why Matthew and Luke start telling us more about Joseph and Mary. The first written mention of Mary is not in the Gospels, but is actually by St. Paul. So this becomes fascinating because somewhere between 50 and 60 AD, the first stories of Jesus are not in the Gospels. The first stories that are told about Jesus are in Paul's letters. And so when Paul speaks of Mary, for instance, what does Paul say about Mary? Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, he simply says that Jesus was, wait for it, born of a woman. That's all that Paul says about Mary. Doesn't say her name, doesn't say how old she was, doesn't say what color her hair was, doesn't say how much education she had. He says nothing about Mary except that Jesus was born of a woman, which means that obviously Jesus was born of someone, question mark. Right? At that point, we don't have Mary's identity. All that we know is that this Jesus, our Christ, our Savior, our Messiah, was born of a woman. The Gospels similarly treat her like many women of the time. For instance, Mark doesn't even give Mary a name, just refers to her as Jesus' mother. Follow me? Her relationship hinges to the male, right? She doesn't have her own identity, her own name. She's just known in relationship to her son, Jesus' mother. In two critical scenes, John refers to her as the mother of Jesus. Again, John, writing all these years later, probably easily 60 to 70 years after Jesus, John is still referring to her, not by her name. She doesn't get her own name. She's just Jesus' mother. It's like referring to Becky as Andres' mom, right? We really appreciate here at Holy Family, Andres' mom sharing her time and volunteering for our parish community. She's like, hello, I do have a name, right? So the first gospel, Mark, actually calls her by name only once, and that's found in Mark chapter 6, verse 3. Oh, for the first time, we're giving her a name, Miryam, which would have been significant because that would have called to mind Moses' sister, how it is that this woman fits within this longer tradition named for this great Jewish saint, if you will. Matthew and Luke both confirm. Matthew was written after Mark and confirms that her name was indeed Mary. Luke is the one who continues that tradition and tells us the most about Mary. Questions or comments before we get into the infancy narratives? What is an infancy narrative? A narrative is a story. Infancy, birth. So what happens is Mark starts his story when Jesus is age 30. So Mark starts his story here. Naturally, the question arose, well, tell us more about his family. Where did he come from? And so Matthew and Luke start giving us genealogies and telling us more about Jesus' birth. Those are known as the infancy stories. Matthew and Luke have infancy stories of Jesus' birth. Mark does not. What about the Gospel of John? Does the Gospel of John tell us about Jesus' birth? No. So of the four Gospels, we only have two stories of Jesus' birth. Which two tell the stories of Jesus' birth? Matthew and Luke. Which two don't tell us anything about Jesus' birth? Mark and John. So far, so good. So when we refer to the infancy narratives, we're talking about these two. Matthew has one story, Luke has another story, and they're different. Matthew tells us about Joseph and Mary's house. Luke tells us about being born in a stable. Matthew tells us that the angel of the Lord came to Joseph. Luke says that the angel Gabriel came to Mary. Two different stories. Luke talks about shepherds. Matthew talks about magi. Follow me? Matthew talks about a star in the sky and how it was that Herod killed the children. Luke tells us about how it is that the angels were singing in the field and calling the shepherds, telling them about the birth. Two different stories, Do you note what happens at Christmas time? What do? We bring both stories into one. We don't just tell Matthew's story. We don't just tell Luke's story. We combine the two, which is why when we decorate the church, what do we put in front of the altar? A nativity scene that brings together Matthew and Luke.
So back to Mary's name. So it says that Mark calls her by her name once. But he didn't write it until 35 years after.
Right.
So maybe he didn't know her name and said, hey, I'll just call her Mary. Possibly.
So a scholar would look at that and say, possibly. A person of faith may throw a stone in your direction. How dare you even suggest that? But scholars do well to ask questions about all sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And so a scholar would ask, well, was that really her name? Did we even know her name?
Right.
What stories were told about her? Because remember, the story wasn't about her. The story was about her son. But when someone started asking, well, what was Grandpa Rudy? What was his mom's name? Grandpa Rudy was on the spot. And we all know Grandpa Rudy well enough that Grandpa Rudy wasn't going to say, I don't know. Grandpa Rudy is going to make up something. And so whether he was going to say Deborah or Cindy or Leticia or Shaniqua or
Moses has a sister named Mary.
let's think about who are the greatest women in the scriptures. One of them would be this prophetess, Miryam, Moses' sister. Oh, Grandpa Rudy, you are genius. Grandma, that night, Grandma Gloria, when she pulled Grandpa Rudy's ear in the evening saying, you're making up a lot of things for these grandkids and they're hanging on every word of yours, buddy. He recognized that, we don't know. It could be that her name really was Miryam, or it could be that it developed as part of this tradition, this oral tradition. It's one of those things that when we get to heaven, we'll each be able to stand before God and have a chance to be able to get our questions answered. God, I have a list of questions for you. Are you ready? And how surprised we'll be when God says, Mary, her name was Shaniqua.
Okay. Say Shaniqua.
Vincent, loud voice.
I've been trying to think of a question, but on 4 Gospels that were written, how did they come across these stories? Were there other books that they put stuff together and wrote their own version of it?
Uh-huh.
Or, because there was no one, like you said, there was no one going around with a tablet saying, oh, he turned water into wine today.
Yeah.
Like a diary.
Yeah.
So were they going by Uncle Rudy's stories, or were there other books that were written and their books got picked to be in the Bible?
Some of the things that were written were these letters right here. Paul did write some letters that talked about Jesus and said that Jesus was born of a woman. That's all he said. That's all he said. So we do have these letters. Don't tell us a lot about Mary, though. After that, we have Mark, who comes along and tells a few stories about Jesus and his interactions with his mother, who thought he was crazy. We'll get to there in just a moment. After that, there is another work here that we're going to put as a question mark in brackets here, because we know that it existed and that it had stories in it, because Matthew and Luke both contain the same stories and Mark doesn't contain them. So they obviously got their stories from the same source. Follow me? And so the question becomes, this source doesn't survive, but things like the Our Father or the Beatitudes are found in Matthew and they're found in Luke. They're not found in Mark. So we give this the code name Q, which comes from the German word Quell, which means source. There's some source out there that we have not yet discovered that has stories in it about Jesus. And we know this only because these two have these stories. So either Luke copied them from Matthew or they both got them from the same source, which is what most scholars believe. So to answer your question directly, Vincent, there was this oral tradition. The oral tradition means the stories that are passed down. There was this oral tradition for many years, and the things that we can point to that were actually written were Paul's letters, born of a woman, the Gospel of Mark, this undiscovered source, Q, and then the first Gospels. And then other stories come along. Remember all these non-canonical Gospels? What does that mean? That means the Gospels that did not make the cut and are not in the Bible, not in Bible. Things like the proto-gospel of James gives us all sorts of stories about Mary, but you know what? It's not in the Bible. You can find the proto-gospel of James online. If you Google proto-gospel of James, you can read what he wrote. It's not in the Bible, but it's all available online now. And there are other gospels as well. But in terms of what were the first ones to be written, Paul's letters, and then we have the gospel tradition. It's almost like you can imagine Paul not saying anything about Jesus' mother and people beginning to ask the question, well, tell us more about, you're preaching that Jesus was Messiah. Who was he? Tell us more about him. Where did he come from? What was his family? Tell us about his parents, his grandparents. What was his favorite color? What did he do for a living? Right? And they start to create various details about Jesus as part of the oral tradition. Is that helpful, Vincent?
So at what point do we, well, I guess we won't, but it seems like divine inspiration and made-up stories are going hand in hand here.
Yeah. I think the word that's on my tongue is faith. That is to say, ultimately, it comes down to our faith. And in the tradition of the church has said, we believe certain things. We don't question, we can question them in the context of our theological institute, but when we come together as a church on Sunday, we don't question them when we're together at church. Instead, we say, we believe. And these are the things that we believe. We believe in one God, the Creator, the Almighty. We believe in Jesus Christ, God's Son, who was born of the Virgin Mary, not Shaniqua, right? There are certain things that we as a church believe. And they're grounded in the tradition of the church. That is to say, with all due respect to Becky, we're not going to start saying here at Holy Family that Jesus came from Shaniqua, because that's not part of the tradition of the church. Follow me? The church's tradition was, we believe in Mary, who was born of the Virgin Mary. Jesus was born of the Virgin, not born of the Virgin Shaniqua. Though I like that. Right? The tradition of the church, traditio, the tradition is something that's been handed to us. It's something that we hand on to others. It's nothing that we change. Which is why we get a little perturbed by our children and grandchildren when they start to change traditions. We've always done something a certain way. We've always had certain foods for certain holidays. We've always celebrated certain holidays certain ways. And then when it doesn't mean the same to them, then we sort of get irked because it's just, we've passed these things down and now they're not passing them down. The church has passed on a tradition to us. We need to choose, are we going to pass on this tradition or not? I choose to pass on the tradition. I'm not going to change the creed on Sunday that he was born of the Virgin Shaniqua.
So, looking at it from left field, way from left field, is that probably why throughout history, not Bible history, but history, that religion has a lot of secrets and people fight over religion because they're afraid of what they may actually find in other books. And they want to keep the so-called tradition one level.
A lot of this comes down to power dynamics. Let's just be honest, right? We hold on to certain beliefs for certain reasons. Certainly, the Jewish people had set up a certain power system where those in power sought to maintain that power through certain beliefs and rituals. The word that comes to mind when I hear you talking about secrets is that in the early church, the word that they used was gnosis, spelled Gnosis. It's a Greek word, essentially meaning a secretive knowledge. So that Vincent could come and tell us about Jesus or God or someone else and claim to have special knowledge that the rest of us didn't have. This was condemned as a heresy in the church. The heresy was called Gnosticism. That is to say, the church would not allow us to believe that Vincent has special knowledge because we are not a religion around Vincent. We are this community religion where we discern what it is that we believe. It's not about Vincent telling us, well, God told me that Jesus' favorite color was blue.